How's everyone doing today? So today we're going to be discussing African contributions to civilization. Um, Many of these contributions that are mentioned come from a text called They Came Before Columbus, which is by Ivan van Sertima. The first I like to talk about is exploration. So there's been an abundance of evidence of African exploration long before Columbus. Honestly, Columbus wasn't even the first European to quote unquote discover the Americas. Um, as you have the Vikings coming 500 years before him. But also, we see African peoples coming to the Americas long before. So, for example, in the 1300s, you have the Mandingos of Mali who traveled and traded with people of Central America, some of which settled there. Um, and we also see evidence of a Kemetic Nubian visitation in 900 BCE, which left pharaonic cultural imprints in Central America. Ra 2, it was the ship that Thor Heyerdahl created in order using similar technology to that which would have been accessible to the people of ancient Egypt to illustrate the ability for this long distance travel between ancient Egypt and Central America. Some innovations that I found interesting that I want to share with y'all. So we have the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which was the oldest medical treatise in existence ever, that was believed to be created around the 16th century BCE. And it's particularly important because of its use of the word brain, and it references the neurological relationship between the brain and the body. We see the use of aspirin amongst the Bantu peoples, and we also see tetracycline, which is an antibiotic that's still used to this day, being used 1400 years ago in Nubia. The smallpox vaccine was brought to the US by an enslaved African by the name of Winsemiss, but the Mano people of Liberia, present-day Liberia, had been using this form of vaccination but the Mano people of Liberia had already been using this form of vaccination. The Dogon people of modern-day Mali centuries ago had a detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system, including Sirius B, which was a dwarf star, which was invisible to the naked eye, and it orbits around Sirius A, which is far bigger and brighter, once every 50 years, and they were able to accurately chart it, right? Also, in relation to the pyramids, there are nearly 400 pyramids on the continent of Africa, but only 138 of them reside in Egypt. Many of them reside in present-day Sudan and other places throughout the continent. And so the history of African Americans begins in West Africa. Family organization, work habits, language, religious beliefs, legends, and many more came to the Americas and influenced the ways that African Americans and others have lived. And so I want to make a quick note on enslavement in relation to West Africa, because one of the most common narratives that loves to be spun around the transatlantic slave trade is African peoples sold one another into slavery. 90% of Africans sold each other into slavery, right? And so I think it's important for us to understand what slavery actually was in the West African context. Every society has had a system of servitude since the beginning of civilization. However, the type of slavery that we see in the Americas, as opposed to the slavery that took place in West Africa or took place in other locations, was vastly different. So in West Africa, slavery was closer to indentured servitude than actual slavery as we understand it today. So under this system, you could gain a significant amount of status and wealth. Slavery was not permanent. Often it was war captives who were enslaved. And we also see a responsibility of the master to take care of and protect the enslaved. It was not the goal to dehumanize them or to brutalize them, but simply to have someone engage in labor for you. And we also see children being protected from being sold, and other ways that people were able to go into slavery or to become enslaved was if they owed a debt, for example. So let's say I owe my neighbor $5,000. I might send my teenage child, I don't have a teenage child, but if I did, I might send them to go work off my debt. That was a form of being enslaved, right? But it's not a permanent condition. My child is still going to be treated like a human being. And another way for somebody to become enslaved in West Africa was for them to commit a societal taboo. So when it comes to religious and literary traditions, we see two main traditions coming to the fore. The Islamic tradition as well as indigenous traditions, which varied across West Africa. And under Islam, Islam is monotheistic, Allah being the God, the only God. And indigenous spiritual systems and religions recognized many divinities, though typically you only have one supreme being. And also a key part of the spiritual tradition, these spiritual traditions, was the invoking or the invocation of spirits of ancestors, and ancestor reverence or worship. And when it comes to literature, there's a very strong oral tradition that comes from West Africa. We see court poets recalling history. These court poets, many of them were called griots, and they would often praise rulers and tell the stories of like epic battles or tell the stories of various divinities. And so these griots were itinerant, meaning they would travel from place to place and were paid to tell stories and often would engage in anthropomorphism in their storytelling. So anthropomorphism simply speaks to the idea that a animal takes on human characteristics. For example, like Anansi the spider comes from West African tradition. The Brer Rabbit stories come from West African tradition as well. And so that is it for our section on West Africa. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.